Hello, this is Eric Morse Eskenazi. I'm the host of the Rack Dispatches podcast. Thanks for tuning into this latest episode in which I interviewed Zach Beach, who is based in the Bay Area of Northern California. He is a practitioner and teacher of yoga. He's also a published author and poet, and he heads the Heart Center, in which he offers consultation for love coaching. And he's also a very prolific podcaster himself with his Learn to Love podcast, in which he interviews other authors, doctors, spiritualists about the importance of using love and improving relationships, sex, and intimacy. Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Hello, I've been using Anchor.fm now for about almost a year for the podcast Erratic Dispatches, which is distributed through Anchor.fm. It's completely free to use, very easy, and any audio that you upload or record through the website, it will be you can use it to organize your audio files, and once your podcasts are ready to submit, it will be available to stream within at least 8 different streaming sites. Okay, so Zach, do you mind starting off with talking about how you first got involved in yoga? And talk about like what brought you into the practice and how long you've been practicing for, and like what inspired you to also start teaching it as well.
Sure, no problem. Happy to. I remember it must have been about 15 years ago. I was at a concert with my girlfriend at the time, and I was like, "Oh, you need to see better? No problem. Let me lift you up." And I leaned over and bent down and lifted her up. And as soon as I did, I was like, I should not have done that. And then I set her down, and then I felt this pain radiating from my low back. And I was like, it's fine. Just dance it off. Dance it off. You'll be fine. A couple hours later, I was in the emergency room with a herniated disc in my low lumbar, and like the most pain I had been in my entire life. For the next few days, I was feeling like I was 80 years old, even though I was in my early 20s. And my physical therapist was like, you know what, you should try yoga. And I was like, yoga? It's like, yeah, right. I can breathe by myself in a room and stretch. And but I took a few classes and took some YouTube videos, and really it just changed my life in so many different ways. So absolutely, for me, it kind of started out as just the physical, which I think it does for a lot of people in the West. We come to yoga because we want to get stronger and become more flexible. But through the practice of mindful movement, through the practice of the spirituality that it exposes you to, I just knew that this is how I wanted to spend my entire life. I was going deep into these practices, working on not just the levels of the body, but the heart, the mind, and the spirit. And part of like what spiritual practice is to me, and part of what meditation and yoga is to me, is just reflecting internally and what really matters most to you in this life, and then making sure you're living in line with those values. And a few years passed, and I realized that sitting in a cubicle all day looking at a computer screen was not how I wanted to live my life, was not in line with my best values. So I decided I wanted to devote myself to love entirely. And yoga was a really wonderful way for me to do that, because I found a job where every day I can tell people to open their hearts. Every day I can tell people to look inside, to find the love that is within themselves. And I get to read poetry. And it's just been a really wonderful and transformative experience. But it really was that single catalyst of like intense injury, like what sometimes referred to as the dark night of the soul, that encouraged me to reflect. And like, you know, I see it now as like a wake-up call, right? Like if I didn't get injured then, it would have happened years later in some different way. You know, became stronger than I ever would have thought before.
And like, do you teach, like, do you have like your own studio, or do you teach at a particular studio? Because I know you do different retreats, like outside the US.
Yeah, I really just love to share my teachings any way, any place that I can. So throughout my career, I've taught at gyms and studios and corporate offices and festivals and retreats. And I've taught everything from like the hour-long power yoga lunchtime flow to 3-week immersions in a beautiful sacred location somewhere in the world. And to me, it's just anywhere I can go to share my passion, I want to go there.
Do you practice every day?
Every day, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. No
And
ifs,
even
ands, or buts.
yeah. And so you've been practicing for you said for 15 years now?
Yeah, it's about that long, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, have you like at the beginning, did you try different types of yoga? Were there any particular styles that you preferred or over others?
Well, absolutely. When I started, I preferred the very slow,
Hmm. Hmm.
very mindful, very deep, long stretches.
Hmm.
But oftentimes we don't know what we don't know, right? So now that I like teach yoga, I'm like, oh yeah, I know the difference between Kundalini or Iyengar or power, Vinyasa or Yin or
Hmm.
restorative. And but at the beginning, of course, all these things are new to me. So I just went into the yoga studio to take a yoga class.
Hmm.
And sometimes I'd be like, what in the world are we doing?
Hmm. Do you usually
um,
like to do you have a preference for practicing yoga like in a like this room temperature room, or do you ever try like going in the heated studios as well?
yeah, I mean, I right now I just started teaching at a studio and it's
Hmm.
110
Hmm.
degree
Hmm.
power
Hmm.
vinyasa.
Hmm.
And before I started teaching it, it was funny because I was like, it's so interesting. The studio only has hour-long classes, and
Hmm.
sometimes I like to teach 75 or 90 minutes.
Hmm.
But then when I went there and I was like, oh yeah, after an hour, you're done. Like you're you're gonna overheat at that point. Um, but oh my god, remind me your question.
Oh no, because I'm just
Oh yeah,
like
the temperature.
yeah, because from my own experience, like I basically, I mean, this is probably I don't know if this is a good or bad thing. Me from my practice since like 2002, I mainly only do it in like the hot studio. It's just for some reason, like I don't know. That's like if I can't, it's hard for me to do it in a room temperature. I have to be like over 100, over 100 degrees for some reason. I don't know.
No, it's really useful for a lot of bodies.
Hmm.
Some people look at like hot yoga and think people are
Hmm.
just being ridiculous
Hmm.
and think that
Hmm.
it's like a hardcore Westerner mindset
Hmm.
that like we have to do this
Hmm.
like hardcore
Hmm.
practice in a hot room. But really, it does cater towards a lot of people with certain things in their body that need the heat in order to
Hmm.
loosen up the joints, in order to loosen up the circulation. A lot of students like have sciatica
Hmm.
normally, but then when they come into a hot room, the muscles loosen up and then they can actually do a full practice.
Hmm. So I'm sure, like, I know that you're based in the Bay Area, so I'm sure there's like tons of yoga studios around.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's
Yeah,
so many. I mean, COVID has changed everything, but
yeah.
absolutely, you could throw your rock out a window and hit a yoga teacher or a studio around here.
Mm-hmm. So I guess like since the shutdown last year, you're mainly just doing a lot of like online, teaching and doing like I saw some of your videos you have on your like YouTube channel where you do different like do different postures and you talk about that and you incorporate your poetry as well into it.
Yeah, COVID changed all of our
Mm-hmm.
lives for
Mm-hmm.
better and for worse. And it's so interesting because if you had asked me like 2 years ago if someone could like take a class online or even do like what is known as a yoga teacher training online, I would have said no way.
Mm-hmm.
But in this new reality, we've had to shift in so many ways. So indeed, like last year, I did 2 yoga teacher trainings. So to become a yoga
Mm-hmm.
teacher, you have to do what's known as your 200 hour.
Mm-hmm.
Some people do it over a few weekends, over a few months. But what can be really nice is doing it in immersion, either like 3 or 4 weeks. So we did a few online immersions, and it was really surprising just how well they went.
Mm-hmm.
Because with each crisis comes a new opportunity,
Mm-hmm.
and being in COVID and being in shelter in place has been a lovely time to turn within, to look
Mm-hmm.
within, to
Mm-hmm.
not have so many social obligations and distractions that the world constantly offers you, but finding your own breath and your own practice and your own values.
When you're leading different like retreats or trainings, like how many students do you have at a time?
Usually like a ratio of say like 6 to 10 students to
Mm-hmm.
teachers is really the best
Mm-hmm.
thing. So if I'm doing like my own retreat, tend to max out maybe like 18 or 20 students. For like
Mm-hmm.
the yoga teacher trainings, we sometimes have 2 or 3 teachers. So we can have a group anywhere from like 10 to 30 folks.
Mm-hmm. And do you mind, Zach, talking about like some of your education experience? I know you have a like a MA and like East West psychology.
Yeah, it's true.
Mm-hmm.
So as I mentioned before, like I think of my life purpose is to bring more love into the world. And when I quit my engineering job to to pursue this path, it immediately became apparent how challenging this would be. Like, you can't go to school and major in love and like get a minor in compassion, right? And there's no like love incorporated that you can apply to get a job at. So once I started on this path of love, I realized I have to carve out an entirely own unique path and explore the myriad of ways that we as human beings bring love into our lives, whether it's the intimate relationship with another person or like the spiritual loving relationship we might have with God or spirit. And as a result, I've kind of just been this continuous student of life, going anywhere and everywhere I can in order to learn about this mystery of love and this mystery of being human. So that's included like the year before COVID, for example, I meditated in a Kopan monastery in Nepal. And then I headed over to Thailand to study Thai massage and loving kindness. And then I went over to India to deepen my yoga practices. And the closest thing that I could find into like a degree on love was this degree called East West Psychology, which combines Eastern philosophy with Western psychology at a pretty like new age, almost like nutty out there school known as the California Institute of Integral Studies. And it's based in San Francisco. And they use the term integral to mean like integrating mind, body, and spirit in their teachings. And that really allowed me to go deep both into kind of our psychological models around love, like attachment theory or object relations theory, but also the deeply philosophical aspects around love that we find in some of the world's spiritualities.
And do you mind talking about like how you got started into writing poetry? Like, were you writing poetry as a child, or was it through like your teaching education that inspired you to start, getting into that?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I wasn't like a writer as like a
Hmm.
young kid. I do read some bios of some poets and they're like,
Hmm.
yeah, since age 5, I was writing poetry. And my desire to write and bring more creative expression to my life was exactly in line with the deepening of my spiritual practice, yoga practice, and meditation practice. And as I reflect on why this transformation occurred, my general like logic is that every moment that we live is a new moment, and every day that we live is a new day. And in meditation communities we say, if you're bored, you're not paying attention, because you don't realize all the change and transformation that is happening around you. And there's one poet that even said that he could write a poem about every second of the day, because every second of the day brings new things to write about. Like, there's so much a richness of being here and being alive. And once I got like into my body and into my heart and into this just flow of life, I've felt like this natural expression, natural creative expression that life has was just flowing through me. And then I had this enormous desire to put pen to paper and to just write and allow the creative natural expression that life is to also flow through me. Right. If you look out the window, you can see that there's trees and birds and an extraordinary array of life forms. And this is the creative expression of life. All these things were created from nothing, from rock that the earth was just a few billion years ago. So something I tell my writers in like in writing workshops that I sometimes do is like, if you really take time to quiet your mind, reflect, tune into your internal truth, and bring that to the surface, then you will bring something to the world that is worth reading or worth enjoying. Right? It's easy to like try to copy other people because of what they do in their work. But if you look within, you'll find you have a unique life experience, a unique perspective that has carried you forward. And if you take this complex inner world to the outer world, it's going to be a gift that people will enjoy.
Do you incorporate your lot? Do you incorporate your poetry a lot? Like when you're teaching your students, like when they're in Savasana, you'll just recite like some of your poems.
Absolutely. So for a long time, I was teaching, and I would always love to share poetry in my classes. So sometimes I would start out a class by reading a few poems, or I would finish the class by reading a poem or two. And Shavasana, most of your listeners are probably familiar with yoga, but typically at the end of your yoga class, you would lay in this what we call corpse pose or Shavasana for anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. And I would often read poetry during these times, and I would always be searching for poetry and finding poems that I love, but inevitably like the poems that I find didn't quite fit the moment. So rather than search for poems to read during Shavasana, I started to write my own poems. And eventually, those poems that I wrote and then read in class eventually became compiled into my latest poetry collection, which is entitled 108 Shavasana Poems. And this has been a really beautiful collection. And it's really taken off because I think both teachers and students have really resonated with it. And I sometimes give my books for free to other teachers or meditation teachers, and I say all you need to do is just read one of these poems in one of your classes and then say this, it's from this book. And it's created this, like, this, it's almost this like do it yourself viral campaign, right? Like somebody reads it, somebody learns about it, somebody passes it on to somebody else. So that's a collection I'm really proud of.
And do you like write poetry every day?
um I try. Right. So the muse, so to speak, is largely out of, our control. And, sometimes I go to like dance events and people will be like, "Are you a dancer?" And I'm like, I don't know. I really like to dance. At what point do I become a dancer?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I also ask the same question to myself sometimes, like, when does a writer become a writer? Like when we all kind of write or maybe journal.
Mm-hmm.
And my general like idea is that you become a writer when you are staring at a page for like 2 hours. Nothing changes. You're frustrated with every aspect of your life. Then that's when you become a writer. But that's the thing. Like sometimes you literally have to sit in front of your notepad or computer or whatever you use to write for 2 hours before something comes. And that thing would not have come if you had not sat there for those 2 hours. So that's part of it too.
So, like, how many poetry collections have you published so far?
So right now, just two.
Okay.
My first poetry collection was entitled Drinking Roses on Sunday. And then my latest one is 108 Shavasana poems. But for me, COVID has really turned into a big writing retreat. I'm used to traveling and teaching all the time. Before COVID, I was abroad maybe 6 months out of the year, teaching in different places in the world. And COVID has forced me into one place. And for me, it's turned into a beautiful writing retreat. So I actually have two poetry collections that are basically finished. And one of them is already being represented by an agent. So I'm really excited about that.
Right.
So she's kind of shopping my book around to publishers. And I just finished a recent one, which I think is going to be a secret for now. But basically, I have two published, and then I have two on the computer that I hope to give out to the world soon.
And then are your poetry collections also available in like audio book format?
Not yet. I have debated about whether or not to put my poetry into audiobooks. We'll see.
But I've seen like you have some videos, like I guess on a YouTube channel where you recite the different some of the poems, I guess, from the collections, or some are those like actually older poems of yours?
Oh yeah, I mean, I love sharing my poems, so I'll even go to like poetry slams and recite poems that I've written. And I have a few audio courses on love online. I have a few video courses around love online, and then I did have this big desire to bring more of my poetry out into the world. So I did recently start my second podcast. So I have one podcast called Learn to Love, and I recently started a new one called Living from the Heart. And each session in Living from the Heart, I read a poem of my own, and then I talk for about 30 minutes on just some general wisdom on what it means to live from the heart. And it's been really nice to expand upon, like, where this poem comes from, what it means, incorporate it into your life.
And Zach, like, talk about how you got into the love coaching, and how long have you been doing that for?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I decided that my life purpose in this path was to bring more love into it, and I had to carve out my entirely own unique path. And right now, I do think of my work in the world as being on the level of the body, the heart, and the mind. So, on the level of the body, we already talked about this practice of yoga, getting people to get in touch with their bodies, even getting bodies to interact with other bodies. So I've taught like partner yoga and acro yoga and Thai massage workshops. And then on the level of the heart, that's where my poetry comes from. I tried to tap into this nature of the heart that we have and put it into words and bring words to this mystery and this ineffable that we call love. And then on the level of the mind is I do love to coach and then educate and then teach workshops. So indeed, I love teaching like workshops around self-love, around loving each other, and even have couples workshops on relationship mastery and what I call building a relationship house. And absolutely, coaching is intimately tied into that, is because it's my opportunity to work one-on-one with individuals on whatever it is that they're working on in their love life, whether it's loving themselves, loving their family, finding a partner, or sticking with their partner, or remaining committed to their partner, to even exploring alternative relationship paradigms like kink or open relationships or polyamory. And that's been concurrent just with my life path. So I would say, yeah, I've been doing it for about 10 years now.
Wow. And I guess you're always like constantly researching, or like I guess you might subscribe to like different journals about that you pull information for, or like I guess do a lot of outside research, I guess.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned before, I'm always a student of
Mm-hmm.
life. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
always reading, learning, taking online courses. And even my latest project, my Learn to Love
Mm-hmm.
podcast, each week I interview either a relationship coach or a therapist or an
Mm-hmm.
educator or a researcher. I'm really excited. Tomorrow I'm going to interview this researcher from Stanford who has done all this research on happiness. So I always am trying to learn, because the depths of the heart are infinite, as I have discovered. And I always love to learn and then bring wisdom teachings into the offerings that I do in the world. So that's everything from courses to talking to people to just being on the ground and working with people.
And when did you start getting into podcasting?
Well, COVID actually brought me
Mm-hmm.
into podcasting because, as I mentioned, like you can't you're in love and like love schools don't exist. So I kind of started what I think of as my own love school called the Heart Center. And before COVID, the Heart Center used to do public programs and trainings and workshops all around the San Francisco Bay Area around developing the heart. So we've done nonviolent communication workshops, compassion cultivation training workshops. And I used to have this workshop series called Learn to Love. And every week I would bring in a new speaker to speak in a new topic to work with an audience. And then, of course, COVID meant we could no longer meet in person. So I decided to shift much of what the Heart Center does, what the Heart Center did in person to online. So then Learn to Love became a podcast. And it's been really wonderful because, as you have probably noticed with your podcast, is you get to connect with anybody wherever they are in the world, right? You're over in New York or Brooklyn, is it?
Yeah, Brooklyn, New York. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm in San Francisco. And that's what's been so wonderful is connecting with other professionals doing amazing work in the world. So literally, yeah, Learn to Love started last March. And because of COVID, basically. But because of that, my audience has really greatly expanded. Like Learn to Love is in 100 countries. Like you can look at the the listener pie charts, and somebody in Denmark is listening to the show. So every crisis, as I mentioned, offers a new opportunity. And with COVID, like much of my world was about traveling and in-person events. And then it has now shifted to more online connection, cultivating my online platform. And then also even my clients have started to be in different places in the world.
I guess some of your guests on your podcast, or were some of them actually listeners of your podcast that like contacted you and said, I'd love to be on your show to talk about, anything that they were working on that might have been related to your own work.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm always on the lookout for guests. And I would say the guests that I usually find through 3 different ways. One, I reach out to them. So I'm emailing people constantly. And some of them email me back in like 15 minutes and they're like, I would love to be on your show. Others take about 3 weeks and then their secretary gets back to me and they're like, how big is your platform? How many listeners do you have? This person only comes on if, you can reach 1 million people or whatever for like the really big names. Another third of the people do reach out to me. So as the popularity of the podcast has increased and people have found out about the podcast, people have reached out to me and said, I would love to come on your show. And that's really nice because it's less work for me. But then a third of people is like a category of people I didn't even think about it, is like somehow I've been put on like different like publicists email lists and different things like that. So like a lot of times, like when somebody, has a new book out, maybe they're not well known, they'll get a publicist or an agency to like handle their media requests. So nowadays, like every week I get some email from some publicist I never heard of, and they're like, pitching this book that this person is doing. And a lot of times it's like way off. Like, it's just, they just blast everyone that they can think of. But sometimes I do find some real gems through publicists that do reach out to me.
And I guess some of your guests are like international. You get people contacting you from Europe, Asia, like wherever.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, most of my guests are primarily United States, people in the United States. Some people just I usually look for like best-selling authors or kind of experts, maybe like, researchers at universities that we know. It is an English speaking podcast. So I'm not going to get so many people from like different countries. And it still is people kind of relatively connected to my network of professionals in the coaching and therapy world. So it's not like quite international. But there are some people that are in different places in the world when I do interview them.
And before like the shutdown last year, like did you ever do like any sort of like TED Talks about love coaching?
I have not done a TED Talk yet. I applied to get a TED Talk and I got rejected. But that's what I realized is part of the process, right? Like the process of becoming published, for example, entails like numerous rejections. And sometimes in my own creative process, and as I'm talking to other writers, I think about this interview I saw with Matt Damon. And Matt Damon said that anytime somebody comes up to him and says they want to be an actor, Matt Damon will tell them no, to give up right then and there. And then if that person then continues on their journey, then they have what it takes. Because an actor is going to need to so many rejections, right? So same thing too with writing. I submit all sorts of poems to different literary magazines, and a majority of them are rejections, and that's also part of it. Harry Potter, they say, was rejected like 15 times or something before a publisher picked it up. So one day I will be on the TED stage.
I look forward to that. So like Hello, thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. So Zach, like in regards to life coaching, like since like the shutdown began, like what, like I'm sure you're dealing with a lot of different topics about like people, or you have had people contact you about, intimacy, lack of intimacy, how to regain that, like, and what have you personally like gained in knowledge, since the shutdown began, like what things were different, I know, aspects of relationships about love or sex, that really, that you feel more enlightened about now than you did before.
Yeah, it's challenging. I mean, this is a total new way of being for all of us, right? This is unprecedented, unexpected. And I think every researcher, like the economist to the psychologist, are going to be studying the effects that COVID has had on our mental and emotional health, and particularly our relationships for decades, because this has never happened before, right? In my own experience, like speaking with clients and other professionals in the field, by and large, like the shelter in place has become what we call a relationship accelerator. So it has kind of made the good relationships get better and then the bad relationships worse, right? So I know so many people who have gotten married and engaged in the past year with somebody that they were only dating, a few months before the pandemic, but because they spend every single day together. And meanwhile, domestic is on the rise, right? And some relationships have gotten worse and worse. And I even have friends who were forced back to move in with their parents. Like they were so happy to like go to college and get away from the home. And then they had to go right back to this home that was very challenging for them. So it has made the good relationships better and the bad relationships worse. And I do love love. I think it is the reason that we're here on this planet. I think it is one of the most powerful and meaningful forces um, that we can discover as human beings. But I also have to recognize that love can bring out the best in all of us when done in the right way. It can also bring out the worst. Right. We do things, people get into toxic, negative, and abusive relationships on the name of quote unquote love. And we could say, well, that's not real love, or different things like that, but in their minds it is, right? In their minds, like if you are a happy husband and you come home to your wife in the bed with another man and you shoot that man, like some people would say that's justified, right? That you've been betrayed in such a way. So love does have an incredible effect on ourselves, and hopefully we want to make sure it's funneled in the positive, joyful way, and make sure we're not going down more negative routes.
And have you noticed anybody that like in your own life that became like more spiritual, or got into yoga since the shutdown began last year, or really developed, strengthened their own practice with love and relationships?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, like with so little external distractions, like it's been a wonderful opportunity to take online courses. I have one friend who's like, if I'm sheltering in place, I might as well go to the monastery. So then like he had to get tested, and then he was like living in our backyard in a tent for 2 weeks to quarantine, right? And then he went off to the monastery in a safe way. So it has been a wonderful opportunity to kind of cultivate these skills. That being said, I do encourage anyone struggling right now to be like really compassionate to themselves, right? Like I have seen kind of like the motivational speaker approach, like you're stuck at home, like get a second degree, like now's your time to like double down on the hustle and the grind. But in reality, like this pandemic, the uncertainty of the day to day and not knowing what the future holds is taxing. It's emotionally taxing on ourselves. And we can honor that, right? We don't have to feel bad that we're not like, we haven't found enlightenment yet in this in this time that we're in. One metaphor that I saw that I've been kind of employing in my own practice too is like, on your computer, how sometimes you have an application running on in the background and it's like draining the resources on the computer and slowing down all the other applications. For a lot of us, that's what COVID has been, right? It's this background stress and fear and uncertainty. And it's the first like mass death for many of us in our lives that we have experienced. And it's a drain, right? It's a drain on the rest of our mental capacities to do the work that we need in the world. So this is where we also have to double down on our self-care, on our self-compassion, on our self-love, on de-stressing certain areas of our life, because there's this endless or seemingly endless impact of stress that COVID has.
With both your podcasts, I guess you record episodes like every week.
Yep. Well, I release them every week. Right. Some maybe 1 week I record 3 episodes. I was speaking to another podcaster and she was like, oh yeah, in 1 week I record 30 episodes and then I release them over the next like 6 months. And I was like, wow, I wish I could do that. But for me, I love to really be prepared for my interviews. So like if my guest is an author, I got to read their book, got to prepare my questions. And also a lot of the people that I interview, they're busy. They're relatively well accomplished in the world. They have other media requests. So sometimes I schedule like 3, 4, 5, 6 months out in advance.
Wow. At least it gives you enough time, I guess, to like research like any of their writings, if they're like been very prolific with that.
Yeah, it's been great too. I've been really enjoying the conversations that I've been having with everyone. Like after studying love for 10 years, I think that I like to think I know a thing or two about a thing or two. But in reality, I've been learning so much from each and every conversation. And the fact that these people are authors and have their own books gives me a wonderful excuse to read their books and learn even more about love. Right. So, like, I had a sex educator, Dr. Lori Mintz, on the show, and she has a book called Becoming Clitorate.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, well, I probably already know, but I might as well read this book, for the
Mm-hmm.
interview.
Mm-hmm.
And if it happens to help me in other areas of my life, that's great too.
So like with your projects right now, like what are you hoping to do? Like if you see yourself in a decade from now, do you want it to be like continuing with the teaching, like advance your love coaching? Like where would you like to be? What were your like your like career goals?
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Like I said, I have two manuscripts on the
Mm-hmm.
computer that I
Mm-hmm.
would love to see out into the
Mm-hmm.
world. And I always see myself as writing. So I hope to
Mm-hmm.
have a few more books out there. I already have like 10 titles in my head that I'm just like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which one am I going to start working on now? As I mentioned, like COVID has turned into a lovely opportunity, and it's
Mm-hmm.
very interesting because more people are very keen
Mm-hmm.
on onto online trainings, online
Mm-hmm.
gatherings, even
Mm-hmm.
online conferences. People are starting
Mm-hmm.
to have. So even with the Heart Center, like we are adding more and more offerings to online communities. So we're doing compassion cultivation trainings online, mindful self compassion trainings online, and really, like, my mission is to have the Heart Center be like the global leading love school. Like, this is the place to go to work on your communication, to work on your relationship, to work on your self love, to cultivate your compassion. And I absolutely want to start doing like an annual Learn to Love conference where people can come meet. But that's on the back burner, right? Till we can
Mm-hmm.
actually gather again. But I do want like the Heart Center to be the world leader in love education. And I do want to continue to expand my offerings, my books, my courses, my coaching clients. And then of course in my own personal life, I hope to have a family at that time.
Mm-hmm. So it's like the Heart Center a nonprofit?
It will be, right?
Okay.
So right now it's just an LLC, but I want to definitely convert it very soon to being its own nonprofit.
And do you like mentor people too to get into love coaching as well?
I don't. It's interesting. Like I'm very tempted to um also have the Heart Center offer trainings for
Mm-hmm.
people to become coaches, but I'm just very hesitant because I'll be perfectly honest with you. A lot of life coaching that you see in the world is a big pyramid scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is a lot of coaches primarily make their money not by their clients and individual clients, because maybe they don't even have any, but by training other coaches.
Mm-hmm.
And we also see this a little bit in the yoga teacher training world, where a lot of
Mm-hmm.
studios offer teacher trainings, not
Mm-hmm.
because they actually have a vested interest in people becoming teachers, but because
Mm-hmm.
they found it's a good way to get thousands of dollars from people.
Mm-hmm.
But um, that's part of the reason why I haven't had a coaching training program, is because I do want to really um, walk the walk, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So I have had a litany of and many hours of coaching, valid coaching, successful experience before I train other coaches into the world, and not use coaching trainings as a way to balance, as a way to compensate for lack of coaching itself being a lucrative business. So yeah, anyone thinking going to life coaching, do some research and due diligence into who you're getting your coaching training program from, because a lot of times they just train coaches, and then we have an abundance of coaches and no actual clients out there in the world.
Was there anything like from your past, that inspired you, like with focusing on love and compassion? Like, was there any like people or situations that you felt like someone was like someone was hostile, or the way they played the situation was so wrong, that you felt like, I have to, you know, gain this experience in order to show the world, not to go that path?
Hmm. Yeah, I have. looking back in my life, I realize I'm very fortunate in that I had a very loving family that I grew up in. So it's almost the opposite. It's not that I saw something bad
Mm-hmm.
happen that I realized that we needed to remedy it, but I
Mm-hmm.
saw something good happen and I wanted more of it in the world because like even for my 50th anniversary, for my 50th episode anniversary of my podcast, I brought my parents on.
Mm-hmm.
And when they were like, "Do you ever remember us yelling at you?" And I was like, "No, I don't remember a single instance of my parents yelling at me." And I thought that was normal. And then I talked to other people about their experience with their own parents. And, you know, that you have the litany of really
Mm-hmm.
challenging
Mm-hmm.
experiences. So, but I don't fault, you know, I don't really fault anybody because again, we live in a world where we aren't taught these skills, right? We teach our kids like some of the most like basic things on physics and chemistry, but we don't teach our children like the most essential things about what it means to be human and what it means to be alive. We don't teach compassion. We don't teach mindfulness of our emotions. We don't teach how to communicate our feelings, how to be vulnerable, how to say goodbye to somebody who's dying, right? We teach our kids so many things, but we don't teach them what is like most important and essential about life. So, of course, like we don't have the skills for emotional intelligence when you live in a very cognitive centric world that focuses on the mind. If you've gotten all about the heart, of course, you're going to find challenges in your intimate relationships and your relationships with the people around you. So, no way, like, is there any necessary blame on anybody because we don't have these skills, right? No one ever taught it to us. So that's where the Heart Center comes in. That's where these trainings and programs and workshops come in to make up for this like incredible gap that we have in our social emotional learning that we simply just need more of in our lives.
And if you had a lot of experience talking to clients from like different parts of the business world that comes this where it's so ruthless and so heartless, you
Mhm.
and they gain, that experience to be more compassionate and loving towards, everybody.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that's why I do love the compassion cultivation trainings, mindful self-compassion trainings, because they're kind of secularized. Like when a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people think about meditation, they think
Mm-hmm.
about Buddhism, or when they hear
Mm-hmm.
compassion, you might think about again religion or Mother
Mm-hmm.
Teresa. But these are kind of secularized trainings that you can kind of bring into different environments, including the corporate world, including a lot of people in healthcare are
Mm-hmm.
burnt out right now,
Mm-hmm.
and indeed, lots of people in this world have sacrificed so many parts of themselves, essential to being human, in order to quote unquote get ahead, in order to achieve this success that we were taught. Right. And by and large, and this is kind of like the undoing of the social narrative that to me is so crucial to so many spiritual practices, is realizing that, happiness is not to be found in just the accumulation of material wealth, right? But the best way to be happy is to make others happy. The best way to feel love is to love others. That the more we give, the more we have. And we live in a world absolutely that focuses on materialistic success as the secret to happiness. And I often think about that quote that we spend all our lives climbing up this wall only to get to the top to realize it's the wrong wall.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So absolutely tons of people in their 40s, their 50s, their 60s spent their entire life climbing the corporate ladder, um, committed to the grind, committed to getting ahead. These people come to yoga and they've completely neglected their bodies, right? These
Mm-hmm.
people come to compassion because they've completely neglected their hearts. And they also realized that material wealth has not given them any sense of lasting happiness in this
Mm-hmm.
life, right? I know lots of like extremely rich people and they're totally miserable.
I guess a lot of them are like in the tech world.
Definitely San Francisco. There's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
folks for sure in San
Mm-hmm.
Francisco in tech. Everyone's
Mm-hmm.
here, Google, Facebook, Twitter, that sort of thing. But it's not the only industry. In New York, you probably have a lot of people in the finance
And a lot of
industry.
startups too, here in the
Yeah.
city. Yeah.
Yeah. And startups will make you work 70, 80 hours a
Mm-hmm.
week because
Yeah.
um, of the promise of the
Mm-hmm.
IPO or whatever. But all kinds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do you hoping like, once the pandemic, once we get through this pandemic, do you hoping people will be more compassionate? Do you see it? Do you sense it now? Do you think? I know there's a lot of uncertainty going on, and people politicizing what's going on, with the vaccines and everything. But I mean, do you? It's like very frustrating. But are you? I mean, are you? I guess you seem like a very optimistic person. Are you staying optimistic about despite everything going on, or do you hoping that once we get through it, people will, we'll reach some sort of summit?
It's an excellent question. So overall, I'm incredibly optimistic about the awakening. I'll call it the awakening of humanity and the awakening of consciousness that is happening right now in the world. It has been relative. That's like in the long term, right? That's like Martin Luther King's quote that like the long arc of justice like eventually curves in. But absolutely, overall, COVID has been extremely frustrating in that, in what hasn't changed and the increasing division that has occurred from it. Like it has absolutely exposed lots of cracks in our society that in my mind needed to come to the surface. Like just as when you remove a tumor, like yeah, you're gonna have to cut, you're gonna have to make that incision, you're gonna have to, it's gonna be bloody, it's gonna be hard, but it's gonna be necessary in order to get to the deeper problem that is inside. And like to me, like, it's frustrating, like it boggles my mind that just one example that in a pandemic that has claimed hundred thousands of lives, that and millions of people have lost their jobs, that the United States still hasn't passed universal health care. Right? We still have healthcare tied to your employer. People are still going to work sick because they have no other choice. It's really insane. Like it's insane that it hasn't happened. And the other kind of like crack that's come to the surface is that by and large, like technology in the way that exists now is not on the way to saving us. And what I mean by that is what's been really clear is that social media, the way the algorithms work, the way Instagram and Facebook works, is just creating more division. Right? People getting into their own little bubbles, own little propaganda holes, own little pseudoscience rabbit holes, whether it's QAnon or other communities that are propping up. And that's, to me, is why the interesting thing about COVID is that these mutual dynamics have come together in that we've been forced to shelter in place, where the only way to connect with other people, not the only way, but the main way to connect with other people has been via social media platforms. These social media platforms will inevitably perpetuate extremism and division. So I think we're realizing this.
Yeah.
Right. And I do think that, yeah, once this thing kind of gets over, is that as we start coming together, it's going to be hard once again to reconnect. But it's really that I do believe in the unconditional goodness of every human being, and that we all want the best for ourselves, each other, in this world. And that when we do start to come together off of the algorithms, off of the technology that's only creating more division, is that we will work together to solve the crises that we are in.
Zach, what do you find to be the biggest joys and challenges of either teaching yoga, doing the love coaching, and doing the poetry?
Biggest joys and challenges. I mean, the common story, and it's a little cliche, but you might have heard this story of two people walking along the beach, and one of them picks up a starfish and tosses it into the ocean, and then they keep walking, pick up another starfish and toss it into the ocean. And then the person observes this behavior and says, "What are you doing?" And the person says, "Well, if this starfish doesn't go back into the ocean, it's going to dry out, it's going to die in the beach." Right? And then the person looks at them and they're like, "But there are millions of starfish on these beaches, right? What difference are you making? You're not making an impact at all." And you're like, "I'm making a big difference on this one." And you hold up the starfish and you toss it into the ocean. So really just the joys that I have is with the one-on-one is if I can make just an impact on one person, then it's all worth it. Right. So if I teach a class and somebody comes up afterwards and says that was amazing, right? I get fan mail now. People
Mhm.
like, I heard, I read this book of yours and it was amazing. I just want to say thank you for putting it out into the world. And that brings me so much joy. And so it's really the lives that we impact, right?
Mhm.
And we can all do this in our lives, right? We can all have a positive impact on the people around us. Every smile that you give to another human being encourages them to smile through the mirror neurons. And that's really my joy is I'm here to serve people, I'm here to serve others. And I try to do that anywhere, any place, anyhow that I can. Um, Yoga is this wonderful opportunity to work one-on-one. Poetry, my work is out in the world. Anyone can pick it up. And then coaching allows me just to go deep and work with people. And it's that human connection that to me is just so beautiful because I think every human being is beautiful, right? I think in general, the human experience, like we're incredibly discriminative about individual differences. We're like, oh, that person's lazy, that person's ugly, that person's pretty. But I would just want us all to view each other as like we're walking in a forest and just seeing these beautiful trees. And like,
Mhm.
you don't ever like, oh, that tree is a little crooked. It's like, that
Mhm.
is the most beautiful tree I've ever seen. It's only existing once at this point in time and never again. So it's really this human interactions that to me is one of the most beautiful experiences we have. And one of the joys that I have is just helping others and serving others and bringing a little bit more sunshine to their life. And in terms of challenges, um, we've been talking a lot about COVID and isolation, and that, of course, is a big challenge because I'm a very people person. As
Mhm.
I love being with people, cultivating connection in the world. And as I mentioned, like we live in a very materialistic society. So much of my work in general is an uphill battle. So, like, for example, I do yoga teacher trainings, and yoga can mean very different things. But one of the most common translations of the word yoga is yoke or union, to bring together. And I'll often ask my students, like, okay, we have 40 million yoga practitioners in the States. Why are all these people wanting more connection and union in their lives? And what is the modern person disconnected from? And the answer is, well, everything, right? We're disconnected from the natural world. We're disconnected from each other. In the dissolving of our community bonds and our extended familiar bonds. We're disconnected from ourselves and our hearts and our bodies because we live in such a cognitive centric society. So, really, just the biggest challenge is going against the grain
Mhm.
of a world that doesn't prioritize love, that
Mhm.
doesn't prioritize connection, that
Mhm.
prioritizes money and wealth and
Mhm.
those imaginary lines that you see
Mhm. Yeah, right.
on the graphs
Mhm.
going up rather
Mhm.
than going down,
Mhm.
and a society that very much does value the mind
Mhm.
over the realm of the heart.
Mhm. And Zach, as we wrap up this podcast, did you want to like read any particular poems of yours?
Yeah, I can read something.
Okay.
So this is a poem. This is from actually from my first collection, and I just want to read this one because I feel like it's very much in line
Okay.
with many of the things that we talked about. So this one's called Letters, and it goes, "You are a miracle. You are unique. In all the world, there was no one like you. In the millions of years that have passed and the millions of years that will come, there will never be anyone exactly like you. And I know sometimes we forget. Sometimes we forget our own magnificence and how wonderful it is to be alive. And during those sometimes, you have to write letters to yourself so that later, when you can't stand the too big slash too small of your muscles slash hips, or that peeling skin around your dimpled chin, or those damn cheekbones that make your face look like, stop. A reminder comes in the mail and says, I don't know you, But one time I saw a sunset over a meadow in Yosemite cast gorgeous fusion rays across the sky, and it lit the clouds on fire. Well, that was nothing compared to your touch and your kindness and the way your nose wrinkles when you're thinking. If there's one thing that keeps us all connected, it's imperfection. We all want to follow our dreams, but some dreams you can only see out of the corner of your eyes, and dewdrops form in those same corners. Well, it makes me sad to think that the white tiger no longer exists in the wild, and to think that there is only one of you redefines the meaning of preciousness. So please, whatever you do, don't cut yourself. And I don't mean just on the surface. I mean, don't cut yourself down, sell yourself short, or picture your being as anything less than the dancing wildness of pure ecstasy, so momentarily captured in a few layers of skin, polish, and beauty.
Oh, that's great. It's really beautiful, Zach. Hello. Thanks for listening to the Erratic Dispatches podcast. We'll be back shortly after a brief break. Hello, this is Eric Morris Eskenazi. Thanks again for listening to this Erratic Dispatches podcast episode featuring an interview with Zach Beach, who's a yogi, author, poet, and love coach. On the Anchor FM page for my Erratic Dispatches podcast, you can check out links to go onto Zach Beach's official website, where there are links to listen to his podcasts and also links to purchase his books. And also, I posted a link for the Heart Center in which you can sign up to get consultation from Zach. And there's also a YouTube channel link in which you watch videos of Zach with his yoga and poetry. Since I've been interviewing authors and writers and all kinds of artists over the past year, I would greatly appreciate any kind of donation, any kind of contribution. I do have a donation button on my Anchor FM page. And also, if you go on the website for brooklyndigitalmediainc.com, then you will see there are various buttons and links to make any kind of contribution, donation. I greatly appreciate all those who are tuning into my podcast now. I know I have an international audience, and so I greatly appreciate any kind of donation, any kind of contribution to keep me going forward with this podcast. And I'll be back soon with a new episode. Take care. Bye-bye.